So last week we left off at the end of chapter 4 of the Gospel of John, where we see Jesus leaving Jerusalem after he had ministered there for the first time, and he stops through Samaria, does some sweet ministry there. He goes into the region of the Galilee where he was from and where he set up his home base of operations when he was ministering for those 3.5 years. And we just get one really brief story about his time up in the Galilee where he healed a nobleman's son. And then as we get into chapter 5, verse 1, it says, after this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So John does not share with us very much of Christ's life when he was in the region of the Galilee. Remember that by the time John wrote his gospel, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the other 3 gospels, were already written. And those 3 guys predominantly wrote about Jesus' time and life and ministry spent up around the Sea of Galilee, ministering up there. And they don't really record his times that he visited Jerusalem. John knows this, and so he seeks to provide that. He talks about things the other gospel writers do not. And he tells us of these stories about Jesus when he was in Jerusalem, the religious city, the city where his enemies were growing more furiously against him, the city where he would eventually be crucified in, the city where the temple was built. And so he's going back to celebrate one of the Jewish feasts. And the details of the story are found, verse 2 says, "Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, which is called in Hebrew Bethesda, having 5 porches." Now, the amazing thing about this is that the sheep gate is still there today. And if you know the city of Jerusalem, if you have it kind of mapped out in your head, the sheep gate is located just north and a little bit east of the Temple Mount. It's right next to the Kidron Valley. It's very close to the Garden of Gethsemane and the Mount of Olives. It's on that side. It's just north of where the Eastern Gate or where the Golden Gate is located. And you know what? To this day, the sheep market is still there, where they go and bid sheep. It's an amazing sight to see because you'll see this really nice-looking BMW roll up, and then this Bedouin gets out who lives out in the desert in a tent. And he gets out with like 10 sheep that are packed into his car. They're coming out the trunk, they're coming out the back seat. It's weird. It's like you still live in the desert. You live in a tent, and yet you have a 50-inch big screen in your tent, and you drive a BMW, and yet you still live this nomadic, wandering life, and you sell sheep. It's awesome. John says, by the sheep gate, there was a pool called Bethesda. And the word Bethesda in Hebrew means house of mercy, which is fitting for the story we're about to get into. Now, the pools of Bethesda have been excavated, and archaeologists have indeed found exactly 5 porches, just as John said it had. These porches would be like covered porticos to provide shelter from the heat. The pools are about 60 feet deep. You can look down and see how deep they were, and it's one of the great places we visit when we go and tour around Jerusalem. And it's also right next to an 11th century Crusader church called St. Anne's that was built on the foundations of a 5th century Christian church. And St. Anne's is amazing. If you've been there, then you remember the acoustics in that place are awesome. I mean, groups are lining up to get into this church because of the way it was built and the way the stone arches are in the ceiling. You sing a cappella in there, and if it can make me sound good, that's a feat. Those engineers are awesome, and so you just sing a cappella, and literally, after you get done singing, the echo is going on for 5, 6, 7 seconds. It's just an amazing thing that we get to visit. Well, verses 3 and 4 say, "In these porches lay a great multitude of sick people, blind, lame, paralyzed, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Okay, John, come again. Because if you missed that, please read verse 4 again. An angel went down at a certain time into the pool and stirred up the water. Then whoever stepped in first after the stirring of the water was made well of whatever disease he had. Okay, that's just not normal. That's a little weird. That's a little strange. But, here's the thing. We shouldn't be that troubled by this because there's many strange occasions of healing in the Bible. For instance, if you remember, there was the time in the Old Testament, in the book of 2 Kings, where the men who were eating out of a pot of stew, the stew was poisoned, and they were starting to die. The prophet Elisha comes, and he puts flour in the stew, and then as the men take the stew that has flour in it now, and they eat of it, they're now healed. So it's like, okay, take your beef stew and get some healing. And it's like, what in the world? But that's what it says. There was the time that Naaman was healed of leprosy after he went and washed 7 times in the Jordan River. Not 5 times, not 6, 7 times. And he did it by faith. And as his faith was operating, God healed him. One time a man was healed because his body touched the bones of Elisha. In the New Testament even, some people were healed when Peter's shadow fell upon them. At one time, people were healed because they touched Paul's handkerchief. And so God can, and still today, he does things in unexpected ways. The problem is when people start to prescribe this, like, hey, touch my hanky. For $99.99, I'll give you a piece of my hanky. That's just messed up because it wasn't predictable. Paul wasn't doing that. It just happened. And sometimes people need a reference point, a point of contact where their faith can be released towards God. It's very similar to the woman that was bleeding for many years. And she knew if she could just get through the crowd and touch the hem of Christ's garment, then she would be healed. And by her touching the garment, it says she was instantly healed. The power went out from Jesus. The power of the faith. The power of believing in what God can do for you. It's an amazing thing. We've seen people healed in this church of physical things. And it hasn't been weird. It hasn't been kooky. Many times it's done in privacy, where it's that family alone with God, going to the doctors. And all of a sudden, the x-rays are matched up together. This was last week. This was now. I don't know where it went, the doctors say. God still works today. He still works like that today. We're going to be introduced to a man in verse 5. It says, a certain man was there who had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, do you want to be made well? The sick man answered him, sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me. We're introduced to a man with an infirmity. This Greek word means that he had no strength in his limbs. His limbs, his arms, and his legs were withered up. And he'd been in this condition, check it out, for 38 years. This was his life. Raise your hand if you're not even 38 years old yet. Yeah, some of you that are 39 are like, yeah, dang it. 38 years, this was his life. And you know what? Not only that, but he was also unwanted. He had nobody close to him that loved him enough who would be there with him and sit with him, who wanted to put him into the pool when the water was stirred so that he could be healed. Any family he did have wanted nothing to do with him. He was crippled and he was alone. And look at what verse 6 says. When Jesus sees him and knows his condition, he says, do you want to be made well? And the sick man answers and says, sir. He doesn't know who Jesus is. He's sir. I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, but while I'm coming, another steps down before me. Now, friends, this man was making a mistake that probably all of us have done and we will continue to do at times. In that he was limiting God big time. He was limiting God in his own life. There's two mistakes primarily that he was making. The first mistake is that he was looking to something else other than God to deliver him. In verse 7, he said, I have no man. I have no man. He was not looking to God. He was looking at what he could see. He was not walking by faith at all. And he was limiting God by not looking to God. And we've all done that at times, where we've let our hearts go astray, where we're not really trusting in God, we're trusting in something else. Not that it's bad for something other than God to come and help us, but when our hearts lean towards it and when we're giving over to it, that's called idolatry. And our hearts have left the simple dependency that God is asking for us to have towards him. His second mistake is that he did not believe in God's abilities. He thought the pool was the only way to get healed. He was looking at the pool, and looking at man. He was not looking at God. He wasn't believing in God's ability. There was an author named J.B. Phillips who wrote a famous book about this problem titled, Your God is Too Small. And so, guys, we need to be careful to not invent with our own minds a small and limited God who is not the God of the Bible, instead of following and believing in the true and living God who is limited by nothing and does great things in response to hearts that are full of faith in him. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6 says, the just shall live by what? Faith. It doesn't say the just shall live by being a good person. The just shall live by doing good deeds. The just shall live by coming to church regularly. The just shall live by helping his fellow mankind. The just shall live by being a good spouse and father or mother. The just shall live by faith. Faith is what pleases God. And when God puts you in opportunities where you're a little backed up into the corner and life is not really familiar, you've been knocked out of your normal routine and it's very stretching for you, that is a provision from God where you can decide and you can choose within your own heart to exercise incredible faith towards God. Or you can be like many other people in the world and be broken and disappointed, wondering why God just didn't swoop in. Well, he would if we would exercise some faith. Faith is the key. Look at how the story ends. In verses 8 and 9, Jesus said to him, rise, take up your bed and walk. And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. And that day was the Sabbath. Now, guys, if you want to get to know Jesus a little bit better through this passage, if you want to get to know how Jesus works and functions a little bit better through this story, then please understand this. Jesus commanded this man to do something that was impossible. What I mean is that whenever Jesus gives you an impossible command, you're faced with two choices now. You can either choose to obey his word, or you can argue and come up with excuses. But if you decide to do that, there's usually a trickle effect, and sometimes those excuses can turn into years and the majority of a lifetime. Here's one thing we must all learn about following Jesus. All of us need to really figure this out and understand this. Within Christ's commands are also found his enablement. Guys, God will never command you to do something that he is not willing to enable you to do. He doesn't say do these things and leave you to be to try to do it in your own power. The flesh cannot conquer the flesh. He'll never do that. You see, the very moment you choose to obey what is impossible by yourself to do, that is the very moment that God will give you all the capacity and all the power to do it. God will command you to do things you cannot do because He's calling you to live a supernatural life. And you know you can't do it. But you know His word is different than man's word. You know His word is living and powerful. And within His words, within His commands, lie the enablement to do it. That when you just say, okay, I'm not going to argue. I'm just going to do it. Whoop. Here comes like your magic mushroom like Super Mario Brothers, and you are powered up. And you're ready to go. Sorry, I just had a 1988 flashback. This man, he believed that. He was touched by what Jesus said. Jesus didn't say much, rise, walk. But he recognized this was not some ordinary man. This was the Word of God. This was God come in the flesh. And what Jesus said to him gave him the faith to believe and to obey. He could have come up with so many excuses. Are you kidding me? 38 years, come on, man, what's up? If he would have done that, he never would have been touched and healed. He would have never experienced the life that God had for him to experience. So, guys, let's not live our lives making excuses before God, because if we just obey what God says, He's going to unleash so much power and so much victory and so much resurrection life, and it's going to flow through us, and it's going to permeate in and around and affect our whole families and our lives. But we must believe, we must have faith, we must show our faith by obeying. And when we obey, His power is just splashed all over our lives. Now, on the topic of healings, the New Testament describes many different ways that people can be physically healed. The book of James tells us that the elders of the church can anoint someone with oil, pray for them, and they may be healed. God's people can lay hands on each other in prayer, ask for healing, and people may be healed. God may grant healing in response to the faith of the very person who's praying to be healed. They're just by themselves praying, believing, and God could heal them. And God may also heal through medical treatment. That's found in the New Testament. But in this case, in this particular story, none of these methods involving human participation are used. Sometimes God just takes the initiative and He sovereignly heals somebody. That's what this guy didn't even know who Jesus was. And God came and He healed him. Also, as I looked at this story, I couldn't help but to think about how there's this multitude of sick people laying around everywhere. They all are desperate for a healing, but Jesus chooses only to heal one person, and then He moves on. I had to think about that. Now, of course, other biblical text tells us that there were other times when multitudes of sick people were brought to Jesus, and He touched and He healed every single one of them. He didn't deny one of them. But here He does not. So what's the point, Josh? Well, it's very simple. It's that God is absolutely unpredictable, and we will never be able to pinpoint Him. His ways are totally past finding out, and we cannot figure Him out. We never will be able to. Just when we think we got a lock on God and we can predict what He's going to do, He throws us up a nasty curveball. Nasty meaning it's awesome. He has His sovereign and perfect reasons for doing everything that He does. And this story of Jesus only healing one guy on this particular day, it was just a reminder to me of the unexpected nature, the unpredictable and mysterious way in which God works. Well, let's read on, because there's something else I really, really want you to see here. Verse 8 again, Jesus said, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. and that day was the Sabbath. The Jews, therefore, said to him who was cured, "It's the Sabbath. It's not lawful for you to carry your bed." So here's these religious jerks again. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more next week. But the story in verse 12 says, "Then they asked him, 'Who's the man who said to you, take up your bed and walk?' But the one who was healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, a multitude being in that place. And afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said this to him." Think about it. It's done. He's healed. But Jesus seeks him out because he has something he wants to say to him. He says, "You have been made well. Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you. You've been made well. Don't sin anymore, lest something worse happens to you." So, for this particular man, his sin is what caused him to have this infirmity for 38 years. Now, before I go on and talk about this, I must say that sicknesses and trials are not always the results of sin. Job did not suffer because he deserved it. There was a dramatic story going on behind the scenes that dealt with God's glory. So don't think that every time you're having a bad day, it's punishment because of some sin you've committed, because that's just not always true. That's not the way it works. But for Jesus to go and find this man and say to him, "Sin no more, lest a worse thing come upon you," this infers that sin is what caused his physical suffering. And guys, this should not surprise us, especially when you think of sexually transmitted diseases. Or alcoholics who end up suffering from liver damage. Or, those who are like majorly addicted to cigarettes, they oftentimes end up getting emphysema at some time in their life. Or they have a much higher chance of getting cancer. This man's story, may it be a reminder to us that sin has brought misery into this world. Mankind's sin has brought pain and death and heartache into this world. Remember that God created all things good. In Genesis chapters 1 and 2, he's creating everything. And he says, this is good, it's perfect, this is all great. Before mankind chose to rebel against God, there was no suffering. There was no physical sickness. Not even a sniffle, not even a little sore throat, no headaches at all. There were no wars, no murders. There were no natural disasters. There was no death. That is not what God intended when he created the human race. In fact, scientists have now found that the human brain has such a great capacity of storage that they are now publishing that the brain can hold information for an infinite amount of time because God created us to live forever. It's just that because of sin, because the wages of sin is death, we just don't get very long to store information in our brains. The reality is that sin, which has come from man's choices, has brought in so much pain and confusion and evil into this world. And guys, we don't know what this man's sin was that led to 38 years of physical suffering and misery, but I bet that when he was a younger man and thinking that he was having so much fun with his friends, he never thought about the consequences it would bring. When his parents or when a teacher tried to warn him of what might happen, I'm sure he just brushed it off like, "Come on, are you serious? It's no big deal. It's not that big of a thing, like anything's really gonna happen." And yet that one thing becomes several things, which becomes a habit of things, which becomes a lifetime where it takes root and has a grip and a control on a person's life. And guys, we've all been deceived by sin at one time or another, so don't sit there and pretend like you don't know what I'm talking about. It's the common denominator about all of us. We're prone to sin. We're prone to lean towards doing things that we don't really want to do. We're prone towards doing things that we wish we didn't do. We end up doing things we don't want to do. I don't want to do it, but we do it because we have this sinful nature. That's why we need a Savior. And so this is a man who for the majority of his life has been eaten up by sin. He didn't just have some sin. Sin had him. Sin had him. Do you know anybody like that? He's alone, miserable, and can hardly even move. And it's to this man in comes the mercy and compassion of Jesus Christ. He was neglected, forgotten, but Jesus saw him, and Jesus reached out to him, and Jesus had mercy on him. And the great thing is that not that he was able to live the rest of his days walking, but that we will see him in eternity because he believed in Jesus Christ. And friends, understand that as we step away from this story and as you get a deeper picture, a greater picture of this story, this is a picture of all humanity. This man represents all of us because we all need fixed. We're all spiritually crippled, and we all have dysfunctional hearts that are just jacked up. I'm jacked up. I'll be the first to confess. Without Christ, I'm really jacked up. If I'm kind of a mess with Christ, without him, you'd hate me. I'd hate me. We've all, like this man, looked to other things for help and satisfaction. But Jesus is the only real answer. Jesus is the answer. Amen?